Estamos reunidos para escuchar el trabajo de Ulrika Maude. Ulrika es profesora de Modernism, y hago esta aclaración porque modernismo en español es otra cosa, es el movimiento de fines del siglo XIX, principios del siglo XX, Rubén Darío, y en este caso es Modernism, y literatura del siglo XX en la Universidad de Bristol. Autora de Beckett, Technology and the Body, y de Samuel Beckett and the Medicine. Coeditora de una serie de volúmenes que incluyen Beckett and Phenomenology, The Cambridge Companion to the Body in Literature y The Bloomsbury Companion to Modernist Literature. Es miembro del consejo editorial del Journal of Beckett Studies y actualmente está escribiendo un libro sobre la literatura modernista y la medicina. El trabajo de Ulrika se titula La telepoética afectiva de Beckett. Beckett's Affective Telepoetics. Te escuchamos, gracias.
Muchas gracias, Lucas, y también a Luz María y la comité científica y organizadora también para invitarme aquí, por haberme invitado, y también para todo el trabajo que estáis haciendo aquí. Voy a hablar en inglés. Ghost Trio, written in 1975, is considered by most critics to be Beckett's finest work for television. Filmed by the BBC in October 1976 and by Süddeutscher Rundfunk the following year, it opens with V, the female voice, describing the set as grey in its colour or non-colour, the lighting as faint, omnipresent, and faintly luminous, and itself as a faint voice. The voice identifies the various rectangular objects visible in the familiar chamber as a window, the indispensable door, and some kind of pallet. F, the male figure, whom V refers to simply as he, is seated motionless, listening to a cassette player, although it takes time and an eventual close-up for the spectator to register this, as the stage directions make clear. F is seated on a stool, bowed forward, face hidden, clutching with both hands a small cassette, not identifiable as such at this range. F himself, furthermore, resembles but another rectangle, which gives him a curious status in the chamber. The play has 3 acts, named as pre-action, action, and reaction. Pre-action, as I've already suggested, introduces the spectator to the highly abstracted set, which Daniel Albright has characterized as being closer to a Mondrian than to modern drama. Following V's introduction of the set, we are presented with a full-screen close-up of one of the rectangles, which the stage directions describe as a close-up of floor, smooth grey rectangle, 0.7 meters times 1.5 meters. And now could I have the film clip, please? I'm going to show you a 2-minute clip from Ghost Trio.
Now look closer. Dust. Having seen that specimen of floor, you have seen it all. Wall. Dust. Knowing this, the kind of wall, the kind of floor, look again. Door. Window. knowing all this, the kind of palette, the kind of window, the kind of door, the kind of wall, the kind of floor, look again.
So, during the first 5-second static close-up, as we've seen, V's voiceover informs the spectator that, having seen that specimen of floor, you have seen it all. The specimen of floor, in other words, stands for the whole floor, or indeed for all floors, for floors in general, in a way that might be interpreted as an allusion to the Platonic theory of forms. In its austere simplicity, specimen of floor represents the idea of a floor and therefore functions as a representation of the Platonic form of a floor. But it can also be interpreted as a reference to the exemplarity of art, which, as Aristotle argues in the Poetics, offers us not merely the particular, as history does, nor solely the universal, as is the case in philosophy, but a combination of the two, the particular or exemplar in the universal. What follows is a succession of further full-screen close-ups, now of the other rectangles that comprise the set. As the spectator views these, V qualifies her earlier statement in a series of unfinished sentences. Knowing this, the kind of wall, the kind of floor, the kind of palette, the kind of window, the kind of door, as if by showing us abstract examples of architectural objects, V's teaching us to see particular, concrete instances of such ideal objects. But the qualifier kind of can also be taken to distance the objects from what they appear to be. Rather than the thing itself, we are viewing simplified or schematic representations or simulacra of actual objects. Rather than the ideal wall, floor, palette, or window, these are imperfect representations of the actual objects. In this sense, the qualifier kind of can be taken to mean that the objects are not really what they appear to be, only kind of. This sense of hesitation over the representational significance of the objects displayed is reinforced by the fact that the rectangles appear interchangeable. They are described in the stage directions as smooth grey rectangle or small grey rectangle, with only slight variations in the dimensions of the cassette player, window, and pillow, while floor and wall and door and palette are all identical in size and shape. The rectangles, in other words, are positively identifiable only because V names them. And yet, since they are identical or near identical, the naming arouses a certain skepticism towards V's words. The play, in this way, suggests that the object before us is not really the object at all, but rather a shadow or a shade, like the shades of grey mentioned by V, or indeed a copy of an already imperfect copy, and one that is made more poignant by the medium of television, a medium that comprises a set of shades or shadows produced by cathode rays emitted from a high vacuum tube, by contrast with a theatre stage set, which, while itself a representation, nevertheless sports at least tangible, concrete objects. And yet, I want to suggest that the verbally and visually austere opening sequence in Ghost Trio is not focused simply on the question of representation, Platonic or otherwise, but also raises the question of kindness. The insistent repetition of the noun kind in kind of brings to mind its homonym, the adjective kind, and V's rendering of it in adverbial form in her request, since hers is, as she says, a faint voice, to kindly tune accordingly. What kind of kindness inhabits Beckett's television plays? We might ask. What kind of kindness do his plays encourage, generate, or imply? What kind of affect is involved, and how is empathy evoked or triggered by these strangely abstracted worlds? F, the male figure, has a curious status in the play. No longer a character, he is one of a long line of late Beckettian players. Throughout Ghost Trio, with careful attention to posture and the familiar Beckettian greatcoat as his costume, F assumes a highly abstracted form, so abstracted indeed that for whole stretches of the play he resembles, as I say, one of its many rectangles, as you can see there. There is a radical dehumanization at work in this figure, in other words, which is also at work rather differently in the way that F may be said to belong to Beckett's equally distinguished line of catatonics. The most famous of these can be found in the 1938 novel Murphy, which features Mr. Endon, a catatonic schizophrenic, who inhabits a padded cell and whose Greek name, Endon, meaning within, reinforces the reader's sense of his detachment. The novel also features the patient Clark, who is described as having been for 3 weeks in a catatonic stupor, and whom C.C. Mays and Chris Ackerley have identified with the Irish poet Austin Clarke, who suffered a breakdown in 1919 and was admitted to St. Patrick's Asylum. After witnessing Murphy in his rocking chair, Ticklepenny, another character, exclaims to him that you had a great look of Clark there a minute ago. Murphy has fallen under the spell of Mr. Endon, but from the opening pages of the novel, the reader has encountered him in a near catatonic state, tied to his rocking chair as he is with 6 rather than the 7 scarves that the narrator mentions. The phrase catatonic stupor appears again in the 1953 novel What, while Christine Jones has described another of Beckett's rocking chair-bound figures, W in Rockabye, as a catatonic, and one could also say the same of May, the protagonist of the play's companion piece, Footfalls. Catatonia comes from the Greek kata, down or under, and tonos, tone or tension, which might bring to mind Ghost Trio's other reference to low tone in V's comment, "Mine is a faint voice, kindly tune accordingly." She reminds us a few lines later to keep that sound down. Catatonia presents in schizophrenia, but it is also a symptom of a number of other psychiatric, neurological, and psychological disorders. We know that Beckett came across the condition in his reading of Otto Rank's The Trauma of Birth from 1929, where it is treated as a complete rejection of the outer world and a regression to the fetal stage. And he would also have encountered catatonia in his reading of Ernest Jones's Papers on Psychoanalysis from 1923, where it is associated with dementia praecox, or in other words, schizophrenia. Catatonia is characterized by psychomotor stupor, a word, as we've seen, that Beckett himself used in the phrase catatonic stupor in both Murphy and Watts, and it is in most cases preceded by grief and anxiety, and in general by depressive moods or affects aimed against the patient by himself, as the German psychiatrist Karl Karlbaum, the first to delineate the condition, described it in 1874. Very common are anguish related to unhappy love or self-reproach resulting from secret sexual misdemeanor, Karlbaum continues. Clinical symptoms of which stupor is the most common, include mutism, immobility or rigidity of movement, analgesia or the inability to feel pain, automatic obedience, and repeated and formulaic gestures and actions. Catatonia is likely to originate in a fear response that in animals triggers tonic immobility or death faint. It is the evolutionary expression of playing dead, most likely to have originated from ancestral encounters with carnivores whose predatory instincts were triggered by movement, but is now inappropriately expressed in very different modern threat situations, such as anxiety, clinical depression, and other overwhelming affective states, including grief. Found in a wide range of psychiatric and serious medical conditions, catatonia may represent a common end state response to feelings of imminent fear or doom. F then has all the hallmarks of catatonia. He remains immobile for exceptionally long stretches of time. When he does move or act, or when he sits or stands, he's repeatedly, at least 5 times, described in the stage directions as irresolute. He is mute throughout the play, and it is unclear from the script or from the BBC and SDR productions whether V directs or commands F's actions or merely anticipates them, whether or not, in other words, his actions can be ascribed to his own agency. What we do know is that V's voiceover announces F's actions, as, for instance, in the opening line of the second act. He will now think he hears her. This is followed by the direction, F raises head sharply. Okay, this is not working. Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, followed by the direction, F raises head sharply, turns still crouched to door, fleeting face, tense pose. This posture is held for 5 seconds as the camera lingers on F. At V's line again, the action is repeated, followed by V's now to door. The stage direction, F gets up, lays cassette on stool, goes to door, listens with right ear against door, back to camera, follows, and I'll show you how this works. And this is repeated over and over again in the play. As if to foreground F's rigidity, this action is again held for the now familiar 5 seconds. Automatic obedience, defined in the Encyclopedia of Psychology as automatically following instructions, any and all suggestions, even those a normal person would usually refuse, in turn is represented in F's apparent compliance to V's voiceover. Formulaic gestures and actions, finally, are witnessed in the repetition of themes in the play, such as this reflex turn F makes each time he thinks he hears her, which is repeated 7 times in the play. The representation of F as catatonic serves at least 3 purposes in the play. Firstly, it allows for a highly stylized, minimal, and abstracted performance. Secondly, it implies a radical evacuation of subjectivity, which is reinforced by the fact that we only encounter F's face in the 3rd and final act, for this is a play in which we are granted only residual, if any, access to interiority. Thirdly, and this is a point that follows from the preceding 2 observations, it allows Beckett to produce marionette theatre, for the rigidity and minimalism of expression in catatonia are marionette-like, and one of the symptoms of catatonia, waxy flexibility, in fact enables the patient's submission to limbs being manipulated or repositioned. As we know, Beckett was much taken by Kleist's essay on the marionette theatre from 1810, and at the time of directing Ghost Trio at the BBC, he referred both the actor, Ronald Pickup, and his biographer, James Knowlson, to the essay. The book had been given to him in 1969 by the German actress Nancy Illig, whom Beckett had directed in Spiel and Hey Joe, which are play, and A Joe, the German versions. In marionette theatre, after all, everything relies on subtle gesture and posture, which is to say, on pure form. Beckett's working title for Ghost Trio was Trist, as he mentions in a number of letters, and as can also be evidenced in the many manuscript drafts of the play. A tryst is a private meeting between lovers, but the word surely also evokes its French near homonym, the adjective triste, sad. The play is enigmatic, for while it appears to be about grief and mourning, its evacuation of subjectivity and emotion in its minimally expressive, catatonic, mute protagonist seems to resist, or at least complicate, such a reading. Furthermore, V makes it clear that her faint voice will not be raised nor lowered, whatever happens, and as Beckett himself put it in a letter to Anthony Libera, she speaks in a distant, anonymous, indifferent voice, one of at times chilling detachment, such that one might well wonder how the play's affective content can be communicated. The title of the play comes from the music F is listening to, the eerie second movement of Beethoven's Fifth Piano Trio in D major, nicknamed The Ghost, and rumored to have been written for a prospective but never completed opera on Macbeth. It is unclear from the script or from the televised BBC version of the play whether F controls the music, which appears when he is in the listening position and disappears when he diverts from it. The volume of the music also changes from faint to slightly louder to growing, without any obvious involvement from F. And the presence of the cassette player also seems to contest an interpretation of the music as an oral memory or instance of F's imagination. The music, which clearly substitutes for the visual or vocal expression of emotion, however, simultaneously casts the affective dimension of the play into doubt. For as Jonathan Bignell has argued, its emotional charge is lessened by the play's constituent visual and oral components that are here wrenched apart, and that in conventional drama would express the affective content in a unified and structured way. The typescripts of Ghost Trio, furthermore, reveal that Beckett carefully divided the music into segments that were heard or unheard, and that's how he titled them, Heard, Unheard. These extracts do not appear in a linear or sequential fashion. Rather, they are fragmented and reordered, which seems to cast further doubt over the implied solace or redemption rendered by the music. In this way, Catherine Laws has argued the spirit of German Romanticism that Beckett so clearly draws on in Ghost Trio is interrogated, deconstructed, and cast under doubt. This seeming disparity between subject matter and representational strategy, including voice or tone, and the implied solace and simultaneous fragmentation of Beethoven's piano trio, is made even starker by the austere formal qualities of the play's medium. The limited, rigidly framed TV screen, its flatness, the literal shades of grey in a black and white broadcast, made to appear sourceless and smooth by shooting the film in colour and then printing it in black and white. The omnipresent light, produced by the firing of a cathode tube onto a television screen, and its contemporary sound reproduction, which would not only reinforce the performance of V's voice, but would in fact also to a degree be the source of it, by default flat and faint. In a carbon typescript of Ghost Trio, entitled Notes on Trist, Beckett furthermore states in the instructions to the camera that once set for shot, it should not explore, simply stare. And yet, the answer to how the play's affective content is communicated seems to reside precisely in its unusualness and precision of form, in its detailed foregrounding of the artifice of representation and its late modernist, minimal, pared-down aesthetic. The spectator's senses in F's stylized catatonic rigidity, minimal repetitive movements, and bowed-down posture that the play is performing the aftermath of a calamity. This much is communicated visually and pre-objectively. We do not need the voiceover to work out that all is not well. F brings to mind the concentration camp figure of the Mussulman, the individual who is radically desubjectified, as if dead, resigned to his own extinction. Primo Levi refers to the Mussulmen as non-men and goes on to describe an emaciated man with head dropped and shoulders curved. On this level, the play functions through somatic identification without the need to rationalize. And yet, the emotions aroused by the images depicted are not directly experienced as the reality they represent, but are staged and controlled by the subtle arrangements of the play's formal qualities. A key component in understanding how the evacuated subjectivity and abstracted form of the play both arouse and dismantle affect, I want to argue, is V's unmissable modifier, kind of, which is repeated 7 times in rapid succession in pre-action, and the homonym kind as adjective, which also appears in adverbial form in V's twice repeated request of the spectator to kindly tune accordingly. By foregrounding its own medium and artifice, Beckett's television play, with its shades of the color grey, its near-identical rectangles, and the faint and indifferent voice of its narrator, creates in the spectator a sense of tension between the pre-reflective somatic reaction and the detached formalism and self-conscious aestheticism of style. For the refrain, kind of, with its suggestion of both exemplarity and artifice, is a direct allusion to the aesthetic and its performance as form, while F as a gestural figure invites the spectator's empathy, itself a kind of kindness to another, and while the same pre-reflective effect can be noted in the music, the other formal qualities, such as V's flat and seemingly indifferent voice, and the near-identical rectangles it purports to identify, seem to withdraw the invitation, pointing to the inappropriateness of such a response. In Ghost Trio, therefore, the affect-inducing premise of literature or drama, the post-romantic assumption about literature as an empathy-inducing kindness, on which the play unmistakably draws, seems to be undermined by V's flat and indifferent tone, by the clinically framed shots, the grey, abstracted, affectless set, and the staring camera eye. In this way, Ghost Trio destabilizes the spectator by both invoking and stunting empathy, drawing on dramatic conventions and exposing its methods, calling on and undoing the capacity of language to represent, and thereby contributing to the complexity, power, and unnerving effect or affect of the play. By requiring us to look at a kind of floor and then at a floor, at a kind of window and then at a window, it is as if V is instructing us in how to see the world. By looking at an exemplary floor or window, we can then begin to grasp what a floor or window is in the real world of the TV stage set. In a similar way, perhaps, Beckett is requiring us to look at and to see a kind of suffering, an abstracted, dehumanized kind of suffering, suffering that is simplified and reduced to its minimal components in order to instruct us in how to see suffering in the world, and how to be kind. But perhaps more disturbingly than that, he asks us, as we look, to consider what it means to be kind and to think about the kind of kindness that we feel we are projecting when we feel empathy. In abstracting and distancing the player in Ghost Trio, in evacuating the figure of almost all human attributes and affects, speech, interiority, agency, individuality, emotion, a face even until the final act, Beckett confronts us with the limits of our own impulse towards and assumptions about aesthetic empathy, and with the limits, indeed, of our kindness to our own kind. Something similar can be said about the Clouds, Ghost Trio's companion piece. Written in 1976 and first televised in April 1977. In December 1976, Beckett wrote to the director of Süddeutscher Rundfunk, Reinhard Müller-Freienfels, that though not expressly staged, the man in Bat the Clouds is the same as in Ghost Trio in another, later situation. The title, as is well known, comes from Yeats's poem, The Tower, from 1928, and the play has a similarly elegiac, melancholic tone in M's yearning for W, the female figure, to appear to him. And yet, embedded in M's lyrical and melancholic lines are others that bear a disturbing resemblance to stage directions. M rehearses his movements in detail. Shed my hat and greatcoat, assumed robe and skull, reappeared and stood as before, only facing the other way, exhibiting the other outline, finally turned and vanished. But M also keeps revising his account, and lines such as, no, that is not right, or let us now make sure that we have got it right, appear to suggest, in a curious candor that seems to exceed the confines of a metadramatic context, that grief is here staged as a near mechanical performance, and that what we are witnessing is a peculiar choreography of mourning in which the object, the close-up of woman's face, reduced as far as possible to eyes and mouth, which appears as same throughout, is reduced to a schematized prop. Here mourning, as Freud argued in his famous essay, Mourning and Melancholia, seems to have become a bad habit, a habitus whose mechanics the play exposes. Ruby Cohn comments that the play is marred by over-reverence, and she also complains about M's invariant routine and costume changes. But these seem precisely intended to distance the spectator from the lyricism and affective excesses of Yeats's poem, and to deliberately foreground the rehearsed and staged mechanics of affect in the play. Furthermore, M's bowler hat, which you can just about spot there, see there, another familiar Beckettian prop, together with M's curiously stylized gait, verge on the comical, bringing to mind silent film, and particularly Beckett's love of Charlie Chaplin. While the grey robe and skullcap, in turn, are reminiscent of the formal minimalism of no theatre, NOH, no theatre. The play also stages a preoccupation with numbers, which further distances us from the more lyrical or affect-laden passages, such as M's observation of a fourth case, or case naught, which appears, and I quote, in the proportion, say, of 999 to 1 or 998 to 2, of M begging in vain for W to appear. These seem to point to the obsessive, compulsive nature of M's grief, objectifying and quantifying its outcomes, and distancing us from the pathos of Yeats's elegiac lines, while foregrounding instead the more clinical mechanics of melancholia. But this desire to distance the self, as Yeats put it, from the wreck of body, slow decay of blood, testy delirium, or dull decrepitude, or what worse evils come, the death of friends or death of every brilliant eye, that made a catch in the breath, is also staged in the tower, in its seeming complicity with and simultaneous detachment from, is also staged in the tower, sorry, now I read that wrong, in its seeming complicity with and simultaneous detachment from Yeats's poem, the desire to undo attachments, the yearning to be done with yearning, further complicates Beckett's treatment of affect in the play. Nacht und Träume, written for Süddeutscher Rundfunk in 1982 and first broadcast in June 1983, completes the cycle of plays about ghosts, clouds, and dreams, which themselves foreground the ephemerality or ontological instability of the television medium, as Eckhard Virchow has argued. The play presents the spectator with A, the dreamer, and B, his dreamt self, which you can just about see in the corner. That is a very poor reproduction in the upper right-hand corner. The play, in other words, reproduces or doubles the dreamer's body, and in so doing, foregrounds the virtuality of what appears on the screen. The by now familiar adjectives kind and faint appear again in the telescript. For the spectator sees B's left profile faintly lit by a kinder light than A's. B is confronted by a pair of disembodied hands, one of which rests gently on B's head. The hands then gently convey a cup to B's lips and gently wipe his brow. Finally, R, the right hand reappears and rests, and I quote again from the script, rests gently on B's right hand, followed by L, the left hand that rests gently on B's head. These movements are then repeated in slow motion and close-up, which are, of course, television stock signifying features, and of B alone in these. The iconography of the play, with B's upturned gaze, the ministering hands, the presentation of chalice and cloth, and the use of spotlight, is religious, Eucharistic. It evokes the work of the Italian and Dutch masters Beckett so admired. The play has no dialogue, but instead we hear the last 7 bars of Schubert's Lied Nacht und Träume, and Daniel Albright comments on the slight sentimentalization of the music in the play. However, although the music is romantic and even sentimental, Catherine Laws perceptively raises the question of its origin or source, which is in fact unplaceable or untraceable. The fact that the spectator or reader cannot locate a clear source for the hummed or sung music, since we do not witness A singing or humming, decontextualizes it and disconnects the image perceived from the music heard, undermining the sentimental and consolatory charge of the lead, which in the play both evokes and then revokes affect. Similarly, although Nacht und Träume, as Trish McTeague has argued, may be somewhat unique among Beckett's plays for its visualization of the act of touch, that touch happens only in a dream space, which perhaps emphasizes the failure of touch, relationality, and bodily wholeness, thereby diminishing the affective charge of the scene. Strikingly, the adverb gently appears 5 times in the play's barely 2-page script. The adjectival form, gentle, comes to Middle English from the Old French gentil, meaning of noble birth, high-born, as in gentleman. But by the 16th century, the word had come to be used for someone mild or moderate in action or disposition. In contemporary usage, the adverb gently is synonymous with mildly, tenderly, and kindly, the latter, as we've seen, familiar to us from Ghost Trio. Beckett is again interested in Nacht und Träume, in the kind of gentleness or kindness rendered by art, something that he no doubt encountered in the old masters, whose work the play evokes, and in the Schubert Lied that lends the play its title, and that is also staged in Beethoven's piano trio F listens to in Ghost Trio, and in the Yeats poem that gives back the clouds its title and thematic content. And yet, the pronounced formalism of all three plays, the ambiguity of the music's origin, the play's self-conscious foregrounding of virtuality, artifice, the television medium, and representation itself work to undercut affect, empathy, and sentiment, and to call such impulses into question. The kindness that we might intuit as a kind of ghostly shadow within these austere, formalized, and abstracted instructions to the viewer in Ghost Trio is indicative of the way that in Beckett's telepoetics, affect is both evoked and withheld. Affect here works from a distance, moving us, when at all, as if from a place far away. Yes, that.
Thank you very much, Ulrika. Ahora abrimos el espacio a preguntas, comentarios sobre el trabajo de Ulrika. ¿Alguna pregunta que quieran realizar?
Hi, thank you for that excellent paper. I want to ask a question about a group of terms and about where they do and don't meet. So very early you said that the figure in Ghost Trio isn't really a character. And I'm interested in what that word means, what it carries with it, and in particular how it relates to the psychoanalytic discourse that you were also drawing on. So I think in certain ways what you called the evacuation of subjectivity, seen from the point of view of character and the bourgeois theater that seems to me to evoke, that's very clear.
Yeah.
But from the psychoanalytic point of view, one might say that this staging of the evacuation of subjectivity is in fact not at all about the evacuation, but about getting to something, I'm using this word in quotation marks, primal.
Yeah.
So the fact that he's drawing from a book like Rank's The Trauma of Birth tells us something.
Yeah.
So I just wonder whether you really want to argue that this is about the evacuation of subjectivity, or if it's about representing subjectivity otherwise, and within, in fact, this psychoanalytic approach, and in particular thinking about things like the drives, what's beneath the apparent show of subjectivity and what's really pre-linguistic and so on.
Yeah, well, so yeah, there's quite a few points there. So the first one would be that Beckett, from a certain point onwards in his drama, starts to call his figures players rather than characters, and this is for a reason. You know, they are more marionette-like, if you like. I'm not sort of saying they are marionettes, you know, in a kind of very stark sense, but they are more marionette-like, and you know, subjectivity becomes far more pared down, and I suppose, you know, one thinks of something post-human here. Or inhuman, or, you know, there's a certain kind of, you know, new conception of subjectivity that he's offering us. As to the idea of Otto Rank, for instance, he begins his book by saying something like he wants to establish the biological a foundation of trauma, that trauma is something that's inbuilt in us. And of course he talks about the birth trauma, and catatonia is a kind of extreme expression of this. But catatonia it presents in a number of conditions. It can present in chronic depression, in schizophrenia, in extreme states of anxiety or fear or grief. And the implication in this series of plays, I suppose, is that this cycle of plays, if you like, is that there is some kind of a situation of mourning going on. And catatonia would be something that would be an extreme expression of affect in a weird kind of way that is almost an evacuation of affect. So the kind of paradoxical idea of it being both a subject and not a subject, affect and not affect, is kind of embodied in this catatonic figure that Beckett had an interest in. It's a condition he had an interest in from a very early stage on and read about in the 1930s. Yeah, I don't know whether I'm answering your question. Drives, I'm not sure drives are complicated in Beckett.
This is related to Martin's question, I think. And
Yeah.
I wanted to ask also about this evacuation of subjectivity.
Yeah.
When you were talking about the marionette theater, you described the subjectivity as reduced to gesture. Instead of expressivity motivating the gesture, we have something like pure gesture. And I wondered how that's related to formalism, whether the body, when it's reduced to pure gesture, becomes part of some kind of form, and whether you could talk more about that.
Yeah, that's right. And that's what I think I said, that, that is pure form. It becomes pure form in that sense. Well, I think it's, I suppose, related. Well, it is pure form, and Beckett's very interested in formalism here, and in how, I suppose, my idea here is that he's responding to this idea of the post-romantic construction of literature as a kind of empathy-inducing machine almost, that people who read books are better people because they read books, that reading novels is somehow edifying. And I think that what he's doing here is I mean, I call it telepoetics because tele means from afar. It's affect from a distance. It's poetics from a distance. That while we read, we don't necessarily become better people. How much do we learn? How much more, sympathetic, affective, ethically sort of informed are we when we read books? He's questioning that, I think. He's inducing that and showing us that this is form, this is a formal effect. These things aren't real. They are formal effects of something. And in that sense, this radical sort of formalization of the figures in these plays is a way of foregrounding that, I think. There's something like that going on, I think, that he... they are both, we both identify with them and don't identify with them. And he's exposing something about literatures or dramas or televisions or methods of representation, and why we, in some sense, don't learn from them or don't become better people, necessarily.
They're kind of bodies.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. Yeah.
One more question because there's no...
Jonathan? I don't know. I think Jonathan's with.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to ask you what you think about the boy in Ghost Trio, because it seems to me that one of the ways in which that might work is to make us think about affect, particularly because the camera adopts the figure's optical point of view and looks down at the boy, and that's kind of a very odd moment in the play, which also breaks out of the main playing space of the drama as well.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether you have anything to say about how that relationship might connect to affect or the issues that you've been discussing.
Well, that's when we do begin to see F as a kind of subject as well. When Beckett was looking for the boy in both in the German and the English productions, he did say that he wanted a child with a moving face. So again, he was interested in the idea of affect here. And in the third act of the play, for the first time, we actually see what F sees. So when F walks past a window the first time, we don't see anything. Oh, I'm not window, sorry, I mean mirror. We don't see anything in the mirror. We never see his face, and we don't hear or see what F hears or sees. But in the third act, we see the little boy when he opens the door and looks into the corridor, and we hear the rain when he looks out of the window, and we also see his face for the first time. And I suppose that's a kind of reintroduction of subjectivity. Now, why it happens in the third act is, I suppose, to make us, well, I don't know. I don't really know, actually. I haven't really resolved that. Do you have an idea about that? Why it happens?
No, it's just that
I know it
something-
does happen. The third act is different.
I think, I think children in Beckett's work are always interesting, and it's something I've meant to think about some more, but I don't really have an answer, so I won't take up more time.
This is really Daniela's area, children in Beckett. Yeah, but it's, and the act is of course called reaction. So there's pre-action, action, and reaction, and we do see F's reaction, that's what happens. So I suppose, it reintroduce some level of subjectivity, yeah. Sorry, I can't hear.
Jonathan asked exactly the same question I wanted to ask, because I was curious to see what a very impressive reading of just exactly what the architecture of that play is. And but it does lead to that third episode, which confuses me as much as does you. Is he happy and relieved that the woman isn't coming? Perhaps the woman in the voice in the beginning? And so the music takes on a whole much more, and that's or here we go again. We waited for Godot. She didn't show up last night. She might not show up. It's another one of those.
Well, see, previously, I have written about this previously, and previously I've read that in terms of technology. So in the first acts, pre-action and action, we see what the camera sees. And so we don't see the boy, we don't hear the rain, we just see the kind of clinical scene, as it were, if you like, the purely formalized scene. In the third action, reaction, the focalizer becomes F. And suddenly we see what F sees. And I suppose, one way one can think about this is that, but it's, not directly related to what I've been talking about now, I suppose, or probably is, but I haven't thought about the connection, is that the human eye and the camera eye see differently. And so the human eye is emotive, it sees affectively, as it were, and hence we can see this touching face of a child. But the camera doesn't see it, probably because it's not there in the first place, or doesn't, and we don't hear the kind of sounds in the corridor and things like that in Acts 1 and 2, because these are, as it were, this is in a sense, I suppose, F seeing ghosts. We see ghosts, probably because we need to see them, is my point, I suppose, yeah. We emotionally need to see them, yeah. Ghosts are evoked for that. That's one way of thinking about it, yeah.
Muchísimas gracias a todos. Thank you very much. Y quería invitarlos.